you, Margaret. Can I just start by thanking Joe and his team for the invitation, to speak here today. I just consider it a great privilege to be asked, and just want to say thanks. And also, if I may, to thank Katrina at the Station House, who sent us on our way this morning with a good hearty breakfast and following great hospitality. So thank you very much. So I think we all agree that we need public services which are cost effective. Every cent of public expenditure must be seen to deliver value to the hard-pressed taxpayers who ultimately fund the public service. Public services must be accountable to a level never seen before. This is essential if we are to begin to rebuild trust in government. Public services must be innovative if we are to find solutions to the myriad of challenges facing the state. And public sector modernisation is a necessity and must form a central plank of any strategy to rebuild and renew not only the economy but this great republic. Labour believes government to be a positive force for the common good. Labour views government as a means of creating the overarching framework which supports the development of a caring and compassionate society, one which provides a safety net in tough times and a help on the ladder of social mobility at all times. And paradoxically, this means that Labour has a far greater interest in public sector reform and modernisation than any other party. We argue that government and the public service are part of the solution, and this places a certain onus upon us. Government matters now more than ever. There is no room in a crisis for the continuation of the business as usual paradigm. This applies to politics, the private sector, and in the delivery of public services. We all need to raise the level of our game. We fully support the principles of the Croke Park Agreement and the desire to provide a framework within which greater efficiency in delivering for the citizen can be secured. The restoration of trust can provide a basis for confidence about pay levels and security of employment in the public service for the future. The devil, of course, is in the detail, and it is implementation of the agreement which will prove whether the principles are brought to life or not. In 2010, government in Ireland will spend approximately 58 billion, of which 22 billion will be borrowed. Roughly 35% of government expenditures will be on the salaries and pensions of the 360,000 people who work in the approximate 572 departments and agencies. And I say approximate because we don't really know for sure how many there are. Government in Ireland is big, complex, and its mission is critical to each and every citizen in this country. Government in Ireland is the largest, the most complex business in the country. Not only does it provide services for its citizens, it also provides the vital framework of laws and regulations without which business and indeed civil society could not function. But, and there's always a but, we must accept that failures in the public service, and in particular in those agencies regulating financial services, were a contributory factor to the financial crisis which has nearly destroyed our banking system. And this is why, perhaps on occasions like this, we need to take on board the things that people like Don Tornell is saying about the idea that perhaps a reform of the legislation such that, in certain circumstances, sanctions may apply to those people who are not performing to the best of their ability. And let me be diplomatic in the language that I use. It's clear to us that the performance of the regulator as a public servant was clearly and utterly bereft of any proper scrutiny. And we didn't have light touch regulation, we had no touch regulation. This allowed the development of a fiscal tapeworm that was and is Anglo-Irish Bank. And at the foundation of the state, we inherited a civil service free of corruption an inheritance which made the task of nation building much easier than it might otherwise have been. The quality and commitment of Ireland's civil service also played a vital role in laying the foundation of Ireland's economic transformation. But now the problems facing the public service tend to be problems of systems failures rather than poor quality of personnel. We are fortunate to have a public service staffed by people with talent, imagination and commitment, but the system too often ignores the talent, stifles the imagination and does not value the commitment of its staff. Over time, it has grown in response to public demand or public need, taking over functions from the church, from the family, and indeed inventing functions never seen before. In doing so, it has adapted to changing demands by creating new departments and agencies and adapting old ones. And in the words of one senior civil servant, to quote, if you wanted to design a government from scratch, you would not end up with what we have now. And there is absolutely no doubt that the quality of service in Ireland has improved in many areas, and these have been elucidated. One of the main aims of the public service modernisation programme has been to improve the quality of the service. There have been many successes, notably the Revenue Commissioners, the Department of Social and Family Affairs, or Social Protection as it is known now, the Passport Office, notwithstanding the more recent difficulties, the Department of Agriculture and Food, the Motor Taxation Department of Dublin City Council, for instance. But government is not just about service delivery to the public, it is also about the delivery of services within government, such as procurement, financials, payroll, expenses, HR and IT. These services need to be delivered effectively and cost efficiently. There is strong evidence, for instance, that this is not the case. Take the issue of human resources. The standard ratio of HR to staff in a moderately efficient private sector company is 1:35. In some companies, this can be as low as 1:200. In the Irish public service, this can be as high as 1:19. One complaint is often voiced by both the general public and civil servants, and that is the lack of joined-up government or joined-up thinking within government. This is due quite simply to the fact that government is very poor at internal communication. It is very difficult to get effective cooperation between government departments. And when two or more government departments are gathered together, things tend not to happen. And I've experienced this in my own brief as an agriculture spokesperson. For instance, at the moment we're working on initiatives in relation to how you can grow alternative energy crops. Miscanthus is one of the areas I have a particular interest in. And at the moment, trying to build linkages between the Department of Energy and the Department of Agriculture, it would appear to me that there is no sense that the two are actually working off the same hymn sheet on this one, where you have a specific Minister for Energy, you have a specific Minister for Agriculture, but it's a case of never the twain shall meet. And I think if you had that greater cross-pollination between departments, I think you could work on a lot more initiatives and deliver better outcomes. I use the word silo. I understood the word silo to be an agricultural term until I entered politics in 2007. And I looked up the word silo as it pertains to governance. I got it on Wikipedia, so you'll forgive me if the source material isn't the best, but it does explain it pretty well. This effect, the silo effect, it's described as a lack of communication and common goals between departments in an organisation. It is the opposite of, and I quote, systems thinking in an organisation. The silo effect gets its name from the farm storage silo. Each silo is designated for one specific grain. It is separate and distinct within the organisation. So, a lack of communication from one government silo ensures that ideas from other departments are not taken on board. And I think if we begin to think a bit more laterally about, how government departments interact with each other at a very macro level, where you're trying to influence political outcomes, for instance, we try to grow the agribusiness sector because we want to get more farmers growing miscanthus, so we can offset carbon, so we can develop markets for miscanthus-based products to replace coal, for instance, in residential homes. Then how do we affect that? Well, what we need is the two ministers talking to each other and having a political discourse at one level, and that filtering down so that there's a cross-pollination between the two departments. But my experience, and I say this objectively, I speak apolitically, that I don't see that the two are thinking along the same lines. And that's just a very simple example in terms of the brief that I hold as agriculture spokesperson for the Labour Party. So maybe it is time to rethink the organisational structures and think more laterally about how we can modernise them. But modernisation, as we know it, is prone to what we regard as the law of unintended consequences. In Ireland, we have the example of the Freedom of Information Act, which was a response to the fact that if questions had been answered properly in the Dáil, there would have been no need for the hugely expensive beef tribunal. While civil servants may complain about having to act as research assistants for journalists, and politicians may frown at the release of information on expenses, there has been one very real and serious unintended consequence, and that is many important decisions are now not documented, or are documented as post notes on the file and not in the file itself. Historians are now worried that an act designed to very properly open decision-making to the public gaze may in fact have the very opposite effect. As civil servants and politicians have refrained from creating a paper trail, we may not know in fact how or why certain sensitive decisions were made. For example, will we ever really know what advice officials in the Department of Finance gave to finance ministers over the last few years, if they did so mindful of later public scrutiny? So public sector transformation is not as easy as it may seem, given the nature of the beast, if I could put it that way. The popular view is that the Taoiseach is rather like a Jean-Luc Picard on board the Starship Enterprise. You know, all he has to say to Brian Lenihan is to engage, and all of a sudden the whole of government swiftly turns, or speeds in the right direction. The way I look at it is I think it's more like a Battlestar Galactica, excuse me, if you remember that TV series. Departments and agencies are like a fleet of battered ships, ranging from the most modern to the most decrepit, moving at vastly different speeds, but hopefully in the same direction. So I suppose to begin to wrap up, let me try to make what I have to say somewhat more tangible by giving even a practical case study. And I did some research. I started talking to a few people that I know who work within the public service, and made contact with somebody who did some work on the reorganisation of the General Register's Office. The General Register's Office is the government body charged with the important task of registering births, deaths and marriages. It was decentralised to Roscommon by Albert Reynolds for the imminently logical reason that Albert promised X number of jobs to Roscommon, and when they looked through all of the central government departments and agencies, only the GRO had exactly that number of jobs. Okay? So there was general agreement that the agency needed some modernisation before being sent to Roscommon. Now, this was mainly because the queues in the GRO office in Lombard Street in Dublin were measured not by how long the queue was in the building, but by how close the end of the queue was to Mahaffey's pub. Okay? So one reason why the queue was so long was because a huge number of people had to get birth certs to bring to social welfare, to claim child benefit or passports. Okay? People had to queue to get a piece of paper from one government agency to hand to another government agency. The second reason for the queues was that the legislation meant that every birth cert had to be written out by hand. If you wanted a number of copies, a clerk had to go to the original register and copy down the details by hand, and then make the requisite number of copies by hand. Okay? And this legislation dated back to 1864. So reform in the GRO meant changes in primary legislation the implementation of an IT system and major changes in work practices. But it was not without its hiccups. The computer system was designed to use 24 characters to record a name, which you would think would be, long enough for most names, but not in Cork, okay? Right? One Cork soccer fan wanted to call his son after the names of the entire Liverpool football team. So the system had to be redesigned, okay? So all of that effort was required for just one agency, but it was done. It was completed. So you can now begin to appreciate the mammoth task required to transform the way public service operates. The government claims to have ambitious plans for the transformation, and it has the website to prove it, okay? But for its start, it intends to bring in a number of very highly paid professionals from the private sector, and I would question the wisdom of doing this. I'm not sure that parachuting private sector experts into the unfamiliar territory of the Irish public sector will, in fact, facilitate change. And I think we have proof that the amount of money that we spend on consultants in this country, outside agencies, who how would I put, reinvent themselves every time the spotlight comes on them, auditors and so on and so forth. We're sick to death of reports from consultants. We believe that the grey matter, that the willingness is there within the public sector itself, I think, at this time in our history to effect some change. And we think you just need to pull out those people. They are few and far between, but they are there. You can pull them out, and those people that are willing to do it, I think you can use that grey matter and that resource that's there. It is within, and it's inherent within the sector. You just need to find it. There are people who know where the problems are and what the solutions are, and they are already within the service. We need to empower public service leaders to lead, to take risks and to drive change, but we do need to punish inertia. And the one thing that's killing it at the moment, in my mind, and this is based on my own experience. For instance, this morning I took a call from a lady who was allocated a house in my own county, for instance, and the house is unsuitable for her needs. She has a very genuine case. I have put quite a number of calls into a person, 3 calls, and I'm still waiting for a call back in relation to her needs. Now, the person that I'm dealing with within the service is a very good person, but there is a sense in which sometimes there is a sense of inertia or a lack of urgency or a lack of willingness there. And it's a very minute example, but you do sense that sometimes it exists. And perhaps we need to empower more people within the service to make decisions, to take a little bit of a risk, to think a little bit more laterally. If you can change that kind of culture, then I think you'll get marvellous results in terms of the outcomes. That said, public service leaders, they need to understand that bonuses are a reward for achievement and not just for turning up on the day. If we are to really drive public sector reform, I believe that we need to think big, start small and scale fast. And by thinking big, we need to have a vision for the public service that inspires people in the service and commands the respect of people outside it. Ireland should aim to have a world-class public service, and that the Irish people know when they hand over their taxes, they are getting the value for money. And I don't see any reason why people like Blair and Don Tornell couldn't work together, because I think between that grey matter that you have, you've got the mix of, okay, 2 different cultures, perhaps 2 different types of thinking, but the culture just needs to be changed. And I think you have there, even within this room, the expertise perhaps to bring people together to formulate an overarching view of where we want to go and what we want to achieve. We need to start small. The nature and the range of public services is so great that we cannot reform everything at once. We need to pick a number of areas and start reform projects. Those that are working, we scale them quickly. Those that aren't, we kill them quickly. Okay? One of the biggest problems in public sector reform is that people try to save dumb ideas because they think they've spent too much on them to let them die. And PPARS was a classical example of that. Okay? We need to scale it fast. The projects that are working, put the resources into them and grow them quickly throughout the whole sector. Public sector reform it's like a Munster hurling final, okay? And we know, I was there last Saturday, okay? You have to take your points. If you don't take your points, you can't wait for the big goal. You have to take your points, okay? That's the most important thing. So you make incremental changes. There's too much ad hocery still within the service, and there's too much ad hocery in how we develop the career paths of civil servants. I would be all for the idea, for instance, that where you have X number of graduates coming out of colleges every year, I don't see any reason why, for instance, you couldn't take 1,000 graduates and give them a 1-year graduate training programme or a 2-year graduate training programme, depending on their discipline, and start inculcating them into the public sector. And start inculcating the idea within graduates that, you know, a career in the public sector once more is a good place to be, subject, of course, and on the proviso that we would have the transformation that is needed. I think in the last 10 years, and people of my generation, we didn't see it as a very desirable way to go because you could make a lot more money in the private sector. But I think into the future, if we have a transformed public sector and if we create placements for graduates, you know, 1,000, 2,000 per year, I don't see why you couldn't create that coterie of highly educated and committed group of public servants again, and you know, those people will rise up the ranks hopefully in time, and some of them will get out, some of them will stay in. But it's an idea of creating graduate training programs at a time when graduates need to be placed, okay? So just in conclusion, you know, in regard to the Croke Park Agreement and in regard to a transformation programme, we must all acknowledge that asking people to change when you have cut their salaries, cut their funding for their departments and agencies, and sent out your spin doctors to paint workers in the public service in a derogatory light, it is a big ask. So morale is quite low at the moment, and that's something that needs to be tackled as well. If we want change in the public sector, we must start with political change, not just a new government, but a new way of doing politics. And the real hope we have for change is that public servants do not like waste. They do want to do a good job and have ideas on how things can be improved. And we as politicians need to facilitate that, and we need to move away from the business as usual paradigm. I think we as politicians need to think more laterally. We need to incorporate the thinking of people like Don Tornell into our thinking, so as we can think more laterally about how we can deliver it. And I think it's forums such as this facilitate that process. So thank you very much. Go to Mila Mahal.